The National Endowment for Liberty presents At Issue, the in-depth forum on freedom in America today. Hello, I'm Mike Hayes. The host of At Issue is the physician, author, and former member of Congress, Ron Paul. Ron?
Thank you, Mike. As we look back on the changes that have taken place in Eastern Europe since the fall of 1989, it's useful to ask why it happened the way it did and what the future holds. We may find the U.S. is less of an appropriate role model than we thought.
Our program, as usual, will consist of our probe report on what's at issue, reactions from a group of average citizens somewhere in the country, and an in-depth analysis of the entire subject by our panel of experts. We'll begin our probe report, The Collapse of Communism, following this brief message.
This is one in a series of programs that takes a fresh look at critical issues affecting how you live and how you use your natural rights as an individual to make decisions about your life. At Issue is brought to you by the National Endowment for Liberty, because we agree with Thomas Jefferson that government governs best that governs least. The National Endowment for Liberty is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational project. We do not accept state or federal funds. In fact, we don't count on any agency of government at any level to keep this program on the air. Instead, we count on the generous gifts of individuals, people just like you. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. If you missed any part of this message, keep your pencil and paper handy. This information will be repeated.
1989 was a watershed year. From now on, when you read a book or see a movie about international affairs, whether it's serious history or a spy thriller, you'll know whether it was written before or after 1989. Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania painfully, Bulgaria. One after another, the dominoes fell, and where they didn't fall, they seemed clearly shaken. The suddenness of it all astounded most observers.
I think all of us were surprised at how quickly it happened, although I was of the school that felt that the Soviets, once they released the hold by renouncing the Brezhnev doctrine, that they would go in and overturn revolts against the communist system. I believe that once that was renounced, that relatively quickly Eastern Europe would throw off the yoke, but I didn't expect it to come literally almost overnight. I've just come back from the Soviet Union, and in talking to the more candid leadership there, I find that they were absolutely dumbfounded. They thought that adroit communist leaders could do the same kind of a wire rope act that Gorbachev has done in the Soviet Union. There were some, I include among that group Henry Kissinger at the time that he was Secretary of State. His view was that the Western civilization had passed its high point and was on the wane, and that the Soviet Imperial Empire was the empire of the next century. He doesn't talk that way now, but at the time that was his privately expressed view. I think that was the reason for the tremendous cleavage within the Nixon administration between those who believed that and those like me who believed that all you had to do was tell America what its problems were vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and we would rise to the occasion, which we have certainly done in maintaining our strength.
Communists had always claimed to be the wave of the future, and we feared they were right. Think backward in time. Stern Brezhnev, we will bury you Khrushchev, mighty Stalin, visionary Lenin. All seemed invincible. Yet even in Lenin's own time, there was a man who understood. He was an Austrian economist named Ludwig von Mises.
Ludwig von Mises's essential criticism of socialism was that it made economic calculation impossible. He argued that a rational economy relies on a price system to help entrepreneurs and capitalists and consumers sort out how resources ought to be allocated to the most optimum use. That's the essential economic question, how resources ought to be allocated towards their most optimal use. And Mises argued that under socialism, this essential economic element is completely abolished. And why is that? Because to the extent that the means of production are owned collectively, there cannot be trade among them. You cannot trade one capital good for another good. If you cannot trade, then there are no prices affixed to those individual goods, to those individual capital goods. And if there are no prices affixed to those individual capital goods, you have no way of deciding what the most profitable use of them would be. You don't know if steel should be used to build cars, build tractors, sit in the ground. You can't know.
Right now, the economic situation in the country is rather desperate. Last year, for example, the State Committee of the U.S. on Labor and Social Affairs, they've tried to calculate something like CPI here, and they've took the methodology of the Bureau of Labor Statistics of the U.S. Department of Labor, but they've a little bit, here it's based on the market basket for the average family of 4. And the market basket consists of 417 entries. And for the USSR, they've picked 277 entries, but they failed to produce any coherent index because actually 243 of these entries are absent from the state stores. And it's very difficult to trace the price if the product is absent.
In the end, technology tipped the scales. Beamed even from outer space, it was unstoppable information from the West about the difference in living standards and personal freedom that showed the people of the Eastern countries how utterly their system had failed.
The ability of TV communications, particularly, but radio also, to get into the common man in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union made it impossible to continue the old system. We had the fantastic development of Ceausescu being brought down in large part because TV in Eastern Europe was broadcasting their own progress.
Hard economic times face the people of Eastern Europe. As they look for role models, they see a West which has itself crept much farther towards socialism than most Americans perceive.
I think the worst thing that these finance ministers from the East Bloc and the Soviet Union could do is to look at the U.S. economy as a model for their future. I'm very sorry to say that. The best thing they could look at is the founding of the U.S. If they try to copy our institutions, they're going to be in big trouble. One of the reasons we're able to sustain a welfare state, a central bank, an enormous and a very oppressive taxation agency like we have today, is precisely because we had a century to a century and a half without it. And we were able to accumulate an enormous amount of private wealth, an enormous private economy. But they have nothing over there. And if they start imposing antitrust regulations and start a progressive tax system and start a central bank, it'll be a catastrophe. None of these things produce wealth. The only thing that produces wealth are private markets, free markets.
Rather than merely imitate the West, Eastern Europe could outdo it with a new and thorough commitment to individual rights and a market economy. If they choose that road, Ludwig von Mises' prophetic vision will have its chance to shine like a beacon for all people and for all time.
Remember when life was simpler and problems were solvable? When you could rely on good common sense and your own honesty and initiative to see you through? That was back before government regulation got so tangled up in our public and private lives, before paperwork and arbitrary rules took over and individual choice was locked out. The National Endowment for Liberty believes that most of our problems cannot be solved by government, that too much government is in itself a problem, not a solution. These programs are made possible as a public service by people who believe that moral and political rights go hand in hand with economic freedom. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058. Or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Liberty can set you free.
If the government doesn't do something that has to be done, people will do it for themselves.
Each week on At Issue, we show the probe report you've just seen to a group of citizens somewhere in the United States. What you're watching are the unrehearsed reactions of people in Chicago, Illinois, to the probe report, The Collapse of Communism.
Psychology is heading in. The net result is the government gets bigger, but every time the government does something for us, and we lose any right to choose anything on that issue ever again. And that, the bigger the government gets, the smaller personal freedom gets. So I mean, if they want to maintain a democratic society or any sort of individual liberty, they have to keep the government small. You've got to contain it somehow. It's like it just grows of its own.
I think the problem with the East is they saw all these good things that we have, that we, drive a nice car, we can go and get soap whenever we want, and they didn't see the bad things behind it, and they just went gung-ho straight into saying we're now free. I mean, they didn't see the bad things behind our government. They only saw the good, and I think they're fooling themselves that they think they can have all those good things without some of the bad things.
You don't know how they're going to really run. Profit motive, though, is very basic. You got to get the people.
Got to learn incentive,
and this is what the people have got to learn. Of course, there's got to be something out there for the incentive to.
That's what I'm saying. They don't have that.
To have, right? I mean, you got to get the products out there for the people to go work for.
Right. They're going to have to. They're going to have to crawl before they can walk.
If the government does it, then it would just be reinstituting a dictatorship. But if individual citizens do it, that's freedom.
Are we heading toward a different type of economy? And then going back to what you had asked originally, they have the advantage of picking and choosing. Our economy is wonderful in many aspects, but there are some things that if they could avoid, I'm sure they'll be better off in the next 40 or 50 years.
I was glad for them that the wall went down, but I was like, what is their motive? What are their goals that they're working toward?
Winston Churchill said something about democracy being such a poor form of government, but it was so much better than all the rest. Maybe they have the good fortune of seeing what the United States does, and seeing what other countries are doing, and maybe they can pick and choose the way, the good things. Maybe they'll learn, from us.
I think the government's getting too involved in every aspect of our lives, telling us what we're supposed to do, what we're not supposed to, how our money's supposed to be spent.
And trying to censor people and the things that we watch and the things that we're able to listen to and do on a personal level.
They're trying to legislate people's actions. We have to be protected from our own idiocy. We are no longer responsible for our own actions.
It seems like we're all saying our government is as restrictive as the one in the Soviet Union was, only they're more devious about it. And since we all share a little more of consumer things, we're happier.
Fascinating reactions. Now let's see how our panel of experts feels about setting up an economic system from scratch. John Lenchowsky is a professor at Georgetown University and was the National Security Council's Director of European and Soviet Affairs during the Reagan administration. Lou Rockwell is the founder and president of the Ludwig von Mises Institute at Auburn University. And our host and permanent panelist is the chairman of the National Endowment for Liberty, Ron Paul. Ron, surely the events of late 1989 were one of the most joyous moments in recent history.
Well, I think they certainly were well received by most of the people in the world. I think the collapse of a Soviet empire certainly was a great positive move. I guess the full understanding of what this means has yet to be known, and it probably will take a couple years for us to really evaluate it and decide what will replace the Soviet system. But to start off the discussion, I'd like to ask our two guests the same question. A little bit about how we arrived at this point in 1989 where there was this disintegration of the Soviet system. Was it basically because the Soviet-style socialism was destined to fail and that was the reason? Or were there also individuals in the Soviet Union who understood a better way and that there was a positive element of free enterprise and free markets that crept in and was starting to replace? Which one do you think was the most important? Was this an economic necessity or was it something more political? Lou?
Well, I think it had to fail. I think as Mises demonstrated, since they didn't have a free price system, that they had to have chaos and they had to have poverty. They did struggle along through really hip-deep blood, causing, of course, tremendous suffering and disasters for the whole world. But because we supported them with foreign aid through the Export-Import Bank, the Commodity Credit Corporation, because I think we actually strengthened them by our military programs, giving the Soviet state the excuse to its own people that they were threatened from the outside. I think we really helped keep them in business. But I also think Yuri Maltsev was right when he said that what finally overthrew them was Brezhnev's adding Keynesianism to communism. Because Marx, for whatever his faults otherwise, was a hard money guy, actually kind of like the gold standard. And when Brezhnev added high inflation and big deficit spending on top of communism, that was the end, and the whole thing had to collapse, and that's why Gorbachev and the reformers were able to come to power.
So you're arguing it lasted longer than it really should have. It would have met its demise a lot sooner if first it wasn't quite as authoritarian, it didn't rule with an iron fist, plus the fact that they literally got subsidies from the West.
Well, they ruled with an iron fist, of course, during Stalin's period, but there were reforms. But yeah, I mean, the Export-Import Bank, for example, was set up by Franklin Roosevelt specifically to support trade with the Soviet Union back in the 1930s.
That's right. John, what's your assessment on why this collapsed in 1989?
Well, I agree a lot with what Lou just said, but I think there are a number of other factors that entered into it. The failure of the economy was surely part of it. But one has to be careful about looking at the Soviet economy and not to think that it is sort of the mirror image of the American economy. The purpose of the Soviet economy has never been to create wealth. And it's never been to try to put consumer goods on the shelves for the people. The purpose of the Soviet economy has been to create power. And what happened in the last several years was that the Soviet economy was facing a crisis of power creation for the party and power creation for the Soviet state in the international arena. And I think that this, the people of the Soviet Union have always been subjected to tremendous privations by their own communist leaders. There has been starvation, there have been famines, there have been shortages for 70 years. So the fact that there has been a new round of these does not necessarily distinguish this as something essentially unique. There was something different about this. And I think it had a great deal to do with the fact that, other factors got into this equation. One was that there was a crisis within the Communist Party itself. The party was becoming rotten from a Leninist point of view. Party members were beginning to get sucked into normal civil society. Many of the regional party bosses, for example, were, instead of taking the good orders from Moscow Central, were getting involved in the underground economy. In other words, the free economy, the free market economy that was existing under the table in the Soviet Union, and they were beginning to develop forms of self-interest that were at variance with the Communist Party's interest. And as a result, the party cohesion and its Leninist discipline were breaking down, and the central authorities had to do something about it.
So you're more or less saying that it was a political squabble within the party which helped bring it down.
Well, you see, that's part of it. It's not just a political squabble. It's the fact that the party ceased, this is just one of the factors that I'm talking about. The party ceased to have the necessary discipline and cohesion to do what was necessary to maintain its continued iron rule. Now, there were other things. Because of the economic failure and also because of the failure of the Soviet military technology to be able to face up to the sprint capability in technological development that the West has, I think that the Soviets began to be afraid of what possibilities we could do in strategic defense, in stealth technology, and they needed to do what they've always done, and seek a bailout from the West.
In a way, though, that's economics too, because
sure
they don't have the economic clout. But what about positive Misesian ideas in the Soviet Union? I mean, are there more than one or two?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of people who read Mises and are interested in Mises and Murray Rothbard and others of his students. And I was told by one Soviet citizen that this was because these were the great enemies, that whenever Western intellectuals were being discussed, Mises was held up as a monster, and of course that made them think he must be a great guy.
But did the Soviets...
I'm gonna ask Lou and Ron to hold that thought for just a moment. We're going to take a short break. We'll return to more views and comments on the subject at issue in just a moment.
Throughout this series of programs, you will see ideas examined that affect every part of your life. We'll look at issues from a new angle, not from the left or the right, but from the perspective of individual liberty and responsibility. We believe our founding fathers were right. We are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these is the right to life, liberty, and property. We do not accept your money transferred through state or federal government agencies. Instead, this series is funded by direct voluntary gifts from individuals. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Call us right now, 1-800-333-3545, extension 909. For a transcript of this program, specify the subject and send $5 in a stamped self-addressed envelope to P.O. Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058. The National Endowment for Liberty, providing information on America's most precious resource, individual freedom.
Ron, you were about to ask Lou about the Soviet reaction to the criticism of socialism.
Right. The main criticism, of course, that was pointed out in the early part of the program was that under socialism, of course, there's no way to produce economic calculation. How did the Marxist economists respond to Mises when he pointed this out?
Well, I think they knew it in a sense. I mean, Gennady Gerasimov, a few years ago, back when Gorbachev first came to power, told a group of American reporters he'd had a dream the night before, and the whole world was communist. It was just wonderful, except New Zealand. And they said, well, why New Zealand? And he said, we have to have somebody to tell us the prices. And they know this. I mean, they know, and in the fact they mimic Western prices, which is, again, one of the reasons they were able to struggle along.
And of course, they tried all kinds of gimmicks to try to replace the market set prices, and they all failed, just as wage and price control boards would fail in this country and have failed over the years. Well, I'd like to move over into another area of this discussion now, and this is in the area of what's going to happen over there, what's going to replace what they have. I, for one, don't happen to believe that all of a sudden we're going to see the reinstitutionalization of the Soviet Empire again, and I think most everybody in the world welcomes the fact that this has disintegrated. But that doesn't mean that the ball game has been won. I think we have a long way to go. And start with you, John. What do you think is going to happen in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe? Are good things going to happen, or are some rough roads ahead of us?
Well, I think that we should be very careful and not break out the champagne as yet. I think there are distinctions also that should be made between the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. In the Soviet Union, they've tried many types of economic reforms during the Gorbachev period. And Gorbachev himself wasn't even the originator of all of these reforms. They started actually under Andropov. But they've tried Stalin-style labor discipline campaigns with exhortation and the restoration of collective punishment. They've tried a massive attack against the underground economy, where 800,000 private underground entrepreneurs either were arrested or fled their jobs for fear of arrest during the Gorbachev administration. They've tried kind of a half-baked land leasing program for peasants to give them private ownership type of incentives, but in fact that hasn't worked. They're talking about individual labor ownership, which of course isn't going to work because it's not private property. In other words, there continues to be an ideological resistance to the mainstay of a free economy, namely private property. And so our real hope here lies, I don't think, with some new inspiration by the communist leaders that they must move in a genuinely free direction. I think they're trying to save socialism as much as they can without doing the necessary reforms, and instead trying to get a Western bailout. And what we have to do is we have to put our eggs in the basket of the peoples of these the constituent republics of, of the Soviet Union.
Hey, folks, our time's getting a little short here. We need to wind this up. So let me ask each of you to comment on the short run for a moment. Lou Rockwell, what's the next step?
Well, I think we're going to see the breakup of the Soviet Union, and I think that's really the best thing we can hope for. I would like to see, I mean, an independent Russia, an independent Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and so forth. I think that's is a wonderful thing. I think, in fact, we need a whole lot more secession. Maybe we can revive things in the American South if this goes well enough in the Soviet Union. I think the whole key is a movie, a worldwide movie that'll be Honey, I Shrunk the State.
John Lenchovsky, what's your view? What's the next step?
I agree with Lou. I think particularly we should be supporting the peoples of the Soviet Union in their effort to gain their freedom. And we shouldn't be trying to bail out the Communist Party and to try to make it patch its empire back together. I think that our government and perhaps our public seems to think that too much is, should be invested in Gorbachev and company.
Ron, that brings us to you.
Mike, I think it's very clear the Soviet system of socialism has collapsed and it's not going to be put back together. But unfortunately, I believe that socialism and authoritarianism is still alive and well. Unfortunately, also, I think it's too much alive and well in this country, but I think it's an age-old problem. Authoritarianism by government versus individual liberty. Individual liberty generally over history has usually lost out. The challenge is there. Today we have a vacuum in Eastern Europe, and we're going to have a vacuum here because Keynesian welfarism is going to fail here, and very soon we're going to have the same challenges that they had in Eastern Europe. It's up to us who believe that individualism and the free markets are much better than socialism to convince the others that that's the best way to go.
Well, then that's where we'll have to leave it. I want to thank our panelists for being with us and you for watching. We'll be back next week with another vital topic at issue. The National Endowment for Liberty would like to acknowledge the inspirational contribution of James M. Rodney and the sponsors of At Issue, whose generous support makes these programs possible.